For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. I'm meeting with Peter Draper of the South African Institute of International Affairs, who's discussing South Africa and the currency wars. You suggest that the Chinese policy of promoting its exports by using a weak currency is damaging to South African industry. Why do you say this?
Well, essentially it revolves around the China price, what is a very low-cost price emanating from China. The currency is part of that story. There's a whole range of other factors that determine that price, such as very cheap Chinese labor rates, and then various forms of policy support. So I would say the currency fits into that category. And essentially what the Chinese government does is to peg the currency to the US dollar. There's a band within which it floats, but essentially the currency is pegged, and that promotes export competitiveness for Chinese manufacturers in particular. And since the South African government and the South African manufacturing industry is wanting to promote the manufacturing industry, it's an export price that competes in a sense unfairly with what is produced domestically.
You note that policymakers in South Africa are remarkably silent about the problems posed by the weak Chinese currency. What is the reason for such silence?
It's a very good question. I think there's a few things at play. The first is obviously a foreign policy dimension, and probably that's the dominant consideration. So South Africa plays with the BRICS in that geopolitical formation, and in the BRICS China has made it very clear that it will not accept criticism of its currency regime, which by the way doesn't stop the Brazilians and the Indians from both criticizing China, but outside the context of the BRICS. So currency issues are off the agenda, at least insofar as China is concerned. They're quite happy to criticize the US and the role of the US dollar, but not each other when it comes to currency management issues. And then on the broader foreign policy front, South Africa clearly wants a closer and stronger relationship with China. And this has shown up, for instance, in our handling of the now repeated requests by the Dalai Lama to come to South Africa and being essentially denied a visa. And that shows you very clearly that there's a foreign policy calculus underway. We don't want to upset China. Now, the Chinese currency peg is a key pillar of China's growth model, export-driven growth model. So criticizing it is a real challenge to the Communist Party. And so I think those are the two primary considerations. And then perhaps the third one is just the composition of the tripartite alliance and the fact that the South African Communist Party particularly has close relations with the Chinese Communist Party. And so at a domestic level, well, it's a foreign policy issue, but it goes to domestic politics and the balance of forces in the alliance, I think.
Are you critical of the Chinese model of economic development known as state capitalism, which some policymakers seem to suggest would work well for South Africa?
Yes and no. I think, let me start with the no, because what China is trying to implement is what Deng Xiaoping called capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And so they're starting from a vantage point where the economy was completely communist in its orientation. The state controlled everything. That model did not work for them, so they've pursued an incremental process of reform through experimentation with markets, starting with export processing zones and freeing up domestic agriculture and then expanding into a whole range of other areas. And I would say they're still pretty much midway through that process. It's an historic transformation that they're going through, and there's very difficult decisions that they still have to make for the future. So one has to put it into its context. The next question is, does what we call state capitalism in China actually work for them? I would have to say that for me the most dynamic parts of the Chinese economy are actually the private sector parts and not the state-linked parts. And I think South African policymakers really don't seem to grasp that fundamental fact. And in that sense I would say no, it's not an appropriate model for us. We should be looking at the role that the private sector plays in China. That longer-term process of opening up and reform which has encouraged the private sector to take the lead, and particularly the Chinese government's stance towards foreign direct investment, which has actually driven their growth and their exports for a number of decades now. And I think in our case we're picking essentially at the moment what seems to me the bad parts of the Chinese state capitalism model, not the good parts.
At a broader level, do you consider the Chinese trade surplus, especially with the US, to be a potential major source of economic instability?
It already is and has been for some years. So I haven't looked at the recent figures. It's come down actually in the last couple of years, but largely because of the crisis, the global financial crisis. But if you go to any US congressman or even look at the US presidential elections now, everybody wants to bash China. So it's definitely a source of trade friction. There are a number of cases in the WTO that, in a sense, relate back to this issue. And so clearly it's a source of instability in the global trading system. But I would just qualify that a bit and say that I don't think that bilateral trade balance is correctly understood. And so what shows up in the numbers is essentially, if you take the Apple iPod, which is the quintessential example, the final iPod is exported from China into the US and shows up, the complete value of it shows up as a debit on the US trade account. But if you look at how it's produced, actually most of the value is captured by Germany and by Japan, developed countries. And so if you break down the production process and the global value chain through which it is produced, the actual China share out of a total of, say, $2 billion bilateral trade deficit that the US had with China in 2009, about $70 million out of the $2 billion could be considered value added in China. And that puts a very different cast on the bilateral trade deficit. And if you start to measure trade that way, and there's a big push underfoot to do that globally, then it takes the heat out of these bilateral trade imbalances.